The factory floor smelled of solder, machine oil, and the faint chemical sweetness of 3D printing filament that had been running for many weeks. Anders Lindqvist was at the long steel workbench at 6:45 in the morning, which was 15 minutes later than usual, because he had made himself go home and sleep rather than run calibration sequences on tired eyes. Tired eyes made small errors. Small errors in calibration became large errors at altitude in the dark over a mountain drainage in Idaho. The bench ran the full length of the north wall, and Anders had claimed it entirely for the Firewatch build 3 weeks ago. 12 foam-lined trays sat in a precise row along the back edge, each one holding a camera module in a custom-cut recess. Each tray was labeled in his handwriting, small, neat, entirely legible, with a number, a date, and either a check mark or a small circle. 8 check marks, 4 circles. By the end of today, there would be 12 check marks. He connected the calibration cable to Module 9 and opened the software on his laptop. The screen filled with data, thermal response curves, ambient compensation readings, sensitivity thresholds across the full detection range. He had designed the calibration protocol himself over the winter, extending the manufacturer's baseline to account for high altitude, 50-degree temperature swings, and wildfire smoke particulate that could create feedback problems if the thermal sensitivity was set too aggressively. He had tested it in January with a space heater, a bag of ice, and a smoke machine borrowed from a theatrical supplier in Billings. Jacob came through the factory door at 7 with 2 coffees from the place 3 blocks away. He set one beside the laptop without interrupting the calibration sequence and settled onto his stool at the adjacent section of bench. He did not speak. He had observed that pattern in the first few days and adapted to it without being asked, and Anders had noted that as a positive indicator about the kind of person Jake's son was. The Raspberry Pi units were mounted on their rails inside the 12 Yeti cases on the shelf to Anders' left. Jake had spent 18 months writing and refining the detection algorithm running on each board. Anders had tested each one individually, feeding recorded smoke plume data and thermal anomaly sequences through the full software stack, and had found 2 edge cases that produced false confidence scores under specific combinations of humidity and temperature. He had messaged Jake at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Jake had replied within 4 minutes with a revised build. Anders had reflashed all 12 boards the following morning. That was how they worked. Anders found the problems the field would produce before the field produced them. Jake fixed them. Neither of them made a ceremony of it. The 3D printed camera housing sat on the shelf above the bench in 2 rows of 6. Anders had gone through 4 design iterations. The first had a water pooling problem. The second, a stress concentration at the mounting point. The third had cable channels 2 millimeters too narrow, which he had discovered at 11 at night and fixed before going to bed. The 4th version was correct, and he had printed all 12 in PETG over 9 days, checking results each morning. Every housing was dimensionally identical to within a tolerance he considered acceptable. Jacob finished his coffee and pulled tray 10 toward him. He connected the calibration cable, opened the software, and began the sequence without being asked. Anders watched him for a moment, not checking, but verifying that the muscle memory was properly established. Jacob's hands moved with the quiet confidence of someone for whom the mechanical steps no longer required conscious thought, only attention to results. "Number 9 is reading clean," Anders said. "Ambient compensation is within tolerance across the full temperature range. I ran the simulation 4 times. "What were you looking for on the 4th run?" Jacob asked. "Confirmation," Anders said. "Of what?" "That the 3rd run wasn't an anomaly." Jacob nodded slowly in the way he had when Anders said something that sounded simple, but contained a principle worth sitting with. Anders did not elaborate. The principle was self-evident. You do not trust a result until repetition has made trust rational rather than optimistic. Jake had built the same thinking into the detection algorithm itself. 3 independent sensor confirmations before the system escalated an alert. 1 reading was a data point. 3 readings were a fact. The solar battery banks sat on the lower shelf, charged to storage voltage for transit, each one labeled and logged. Anders had sized them for 4 consecutive days of heavy cloud cover with no meaningful solar input, running full system load, including Starlink uplink and overnight thermal imaging. He had then reduced that margin by 20%. In his experience, there were always variables that had not been anticipated, and the ones that caused problems were by definition the ones nobody had thought of. By 10 in the morning, modules 10 and 11 were calibrated and signed off. Anders fitted module 9 into its housing recess, connected the 4 cables in sequence, applied weatherproof sealant to the lens perimeter with a precision nozzle, and set the assembly on the drying rack. He wrote the time in his field book, 11 down. Jacob looked across from the calibration bench. 11 down, 1 to go. 11 is done, Anders said. 12 has not been started. Jacob smiled at the bench. Anders did not see it, but he heard the quality of the silence that followed and understood it was the smile of someone who found him mildly amusing. Jake found him mildly amusing also. It had not affected their working relationship in any measurable way. He connected the calibration cable to module 12 and began the sequence. In the corner of the production room, the 3D printer that had run since January sat idle and cooling for the first time. Its job was done. 12 housings, 12 cases, 12 systems built, tested, and waiting. The last check mark went into the field book at 8:43 in the morning. Anders capped the pen, set it parallel to the book's spine, and stood back from the bench. 12 trays, 12 modules, 12 check marks in a column so straight it could have been ruled. He looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at something he has been working toward for a long time and has finally arrived at. Then he closed the book and put it in his jacket pocket. Jacob was at the far end of the bench running the final power-on test for case 12. The Yeti case sat open, the Raspberry Pi blinking through its boot sequence, the camera array initializing in the correct order, the status LEDs moving from amber to green one by one. He watched the screen until the last confirmation appeared, noted it on his own checklist, and closed the case with the 2 latches in sequence. He looked at Anders. Anders nodded once. "That's 12, Jacob said. "That's 12, Anders agreed. They loaded the trucks in the order Anders had planned in a spreadsheet 3 weeks earlier. The Yeti cases went in first, stacked 2 deep on the bed liner with rubber matting between layers, secured with ratchet straps at angles Anders had calculated to distribute load forces during cornering. The solar panels went in flat on top, strapped separately. The Starlink units, the battery banks, the cabling coils, the hardware bags, each category in its designated position. Each load point checked twice before the next layer went in. Jacob worked from the list on his phone without needing to ask questions. Anders worked from memory and checked against the list when a truck section was complete. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes. When both tailgates closed, Anders walked around each truck once, checked every strap, pressed on the loads with both hands, and stood in the yard looking at the 2 vehicles for a moment. Jacob watched him do this and said nothing. He had learned that Anders' final inspections were not performative. They were the last opportunity to find a problem before the problem found them 200 miles from Billings on a mountain road. Anders' phone rang as they were walking back inside for the last of the personal gear. He looked at the screen and answered it. "We're loaded," he said before Jake could speak. Jake McAllister's voice came through clear despite the Texas distance. "Both trucks?" "Both trucks. Final calibration completed at 8:43. All 12 systems confirmed." There was a brief pause that Anders recognized as Jake doing rapid mental arithmetic against whatever timeline he was managing in Texas. "How's Jacob doing?" Anders looked across the yard to where Jacob was coming out of the factory door with his pack and a hard case of personal tools. He was moving with the easy purpose of someone who knew exactly what the day required of him. "He tested case 12 himself this morning," Anders said, "without being asked." Another pause, shorter this time. "Put him on!" Anders held the phone out as Jacob reached him. Jacob took it with a glance that was half question. He listened for a moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a quiet settling, the way a person looks when they hear something from someone whose opinion matters to them. "Yeah," he said. Then, "I know, Dad." Then, "We'll call you from McCall." He handed the phone back. Anders put it in his pocket without asking what Jake had said. It was not his conversation. They locked the factory at 11. Anders stood at the door for a moment with the key in his hand, looking back through the window at the empty bench. The foam trays were stacked in the corner. The 3D printer sat cold and silent. The shelf where the Yeti cases had been for 3 weeks held nothing but the clean marks their bases had left in the dust. He turned the key, tried the handle once, and walked to his truck. Jacob was already in his cab with the engine running. Anders started his own engine, checked his mirrors, and pulled out of the yard first. Jacob followed. They drove through Billings in the thin late-morning traffic, 2 loaded work trucks moving in loose convoy, and picked up the interstate heading west. The city fell away behind them. The land opened up. The sky above Montana was the particular blue that only exists at altitude, and the road ahead ran straight and long toward mountains that were still a long way off. Anders drove in silence and thought about the installation sequence. Jacob drove in silence and thought about whatever an 18-year-old thinks about on the first day of the most important summer of his life. Neither of them would have been able to explain exactly why, but both of them understood that what had just begun was something they would not forget. The trucks rolled west, 6 hours to McCall, 12 towers waiting in the forest, James and his helicopter in the Smokejumpers base at the end of the road. They came into McCall in the late afternoon with the sun dropping behind the mountains to the west and the Payette Lake catching the last of the light below the town. Jacob had never been to McCall before. He looked out at the water and the timber and the ridgelines above the valley and said nothing. But Anders noticed him sit slightly forward in the cab. It was the right response to the place. The Smokejumpers base sat at the edge of the McCall airport, a collection of functional buildings that made no concessions to appearance and needed none. Everything here existed because it served a purpose. The loft building where parachutes were packed and inspected, the training area with its jump towers and practice rigs, the ready room where crews waited during fire season with their gear already loaded. Anders pulled into the yard and stopped. Jacob pulled in beside him. A man was walking toward them from the direction of the flight line before either of them had opened a door. He was in his late 50s, broad across the shoulders, wearing a base cap and a canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. He moved with the unhurried economy of someone who had spent a long time in places where wasted energy had consequences. Anders got out of the truck and the man extended his hand. "Ray Kowalski," he said, "Base Commander, Anders Lindqvist. This is Jacob McAllister." Kowalski shook Jacob's hand and looked at him with the brief evaluating attention of someone accustomed to assessing people quickly and accurately. Jacob met it without flinching. Kowalski looked back at Anders. "Long drive," he said. 6 hours and 40 minutes, Anders said. "The road from Salmon is slower than the map suggests." Kowalski almost smiled. "It always is." He looked at the 2 loaded trucks. "James is on the flight line. He wants to look at the loads before he commits to a drop sequence." They found James Whitaker doing a pre-flight inspection of his helicopter with the methodical attention of a man who trusted nothing he had not personally verified. He was younger than Anders had expected, mid-40s, lean, with the particular stillness of someone completely at home in their environment. He looked up when they approached, finished the inspection point he was on, and came over without hurrying. He looked at Anders, then at the trucks, then back at Anders. 12 drops, he said. 12 drops, Anders confirmed. Each load is approximately 80 kilograms. I have the weights documented per kit if you need them for load calculations. James looked at him with mild interest. "You weighed them individually?" "Before loading in Billings," Anders said, "each kit is within 2 kilograms of the others. I kept them consistent deliberately." James nodded slowly in the way a professional nods when another professional has anticipated the question he was about to ask. He walked to the back of Anders' truck, dropped the tailgate, and looked at the load without touching anything. He tilted his head slightly, reading the geometry of it. "I can do all 12 in one day," he said. "I'll want an early start. Weather in the Payette goes uncertain by early afternoon on most days this time of year." "We'll have the nets loaded tonight," Anders said. They unloaded both trucks in the long evening light with Kowalski watching from the doorway of the ready room, arms folded, saying nothing. The 12 individual tower kits came off the trucks and were laid out on the concrete pad beside the flight line in a row. Yeti cases, solar panels strapped flat, Starlink units, battery banks, cabling coils, hardware bags, all grouped by installation number in the precise sequence Anders had assigned in Billings. Jacob moved between the loads, checking each grouping against the master list on his phone. The lifting nets were heavy-duty cargo nets from the base stores, each one rated well beyond the load they would carry. James had sourced them without being asked and had them stacked on a pallet beside the pad when they arrived. Anders picked up the first one, shook it out, and laid it flat on the concrete. He and Jacob began loading kit number 1 into the center of the net. Yeti case first for ballast, panels flat across it, battery bank and Starlink to the sides, cabling and hardware bags filling the gaps. They drew the net up around the load and clipped the corners to the central ring with carabiners. Anders lifted it by the ring, felt the balance, set it down and moved one item 2 inches to the left, lifted it again, and nodded. "Show me," Jacob said. Anders talked him through the balance logic once. Jacob loaded net number 2 himself while Anders watched. When Jacob lifted it by the ring and felt the balance and made a small adjustment without prompting, Anders moved to net number 3 and began loading it himself. They worked in parallel after that, moving steadily down the row, the loaded nets accumulating in a second row beside the empty concrete. Kowalski came out of the ready room at some point and stood watching them work. He did not offer to help, and neither Anders nor Jacob asked him to. After a while, he said, "What happens if the system goes down in the middle of fire season?" Anders set down the net he was loading and looked at him. "Which component?" "Any of it," Kowalski said. "All of it." "The towers still have their lookouts," Anders said. "The Smokejumpers still have their training and their judgment. The system adds capability. It doesn't replace what's already here." Kowalski looked at him for a long moment. He was not hostile. He was doing the same thing James had done at the truck, reading a person carefully before deciding what weight to give them. He nodded once and went back inside. Jacob glanced at Anders across the net he was loading. Anders picked up a Starlink unit and placed it into the net without commenting. There was nothing to add. The question was a fair one, and the answer was the truth. By 9 in the evening, all 12 nets were loaded and lined up on the pad in drop sequence, each one tagged with a tower number on a weatherproof label. James walked the row once, checking the rigging on each net with quick practiced hands, adjusting 2 carabiner positions and retying one corner that had not drawn up cleanly. He reached the end of the row and turned back to Anders. 5:30 tomorrow morning, he said. "I want to be airborne by 6. "We'll be here," Anders said. James went back to his helicopter. Anders and Jacob stood on the pad in the cooling evening air, looking at the 12 nets. The mountains above McCall were dark shapes against a sky still holding the last faint light. Somewhere on the other side of those mountains, 12 fire lookout towers sat empty and waiting in the Payette National Forest. Their landings cleared, their structures sound, ready for what was coming. Jacob put his hands in his jacket pockets. "That's a lot of work sitting in those nets," he said. "It is," Anders said. "Worth it, though." Anders looked at the row of nets for a moment. "Ask me that when Tower 12 is live," he said. He picked up his jacket from the concrete and walked toward the truck. Jacob looked at the nets for another moment, then followed. Anders was on the pad at 5:15. The morning was cold and still, the kind of cold that arrives in Idaho mountain valleys before dawn and carries the smell of pine resin and creek water. The airfield was quiet except for the sound of James already running through his pre-flight checks, moving around the helicopter with a headlamp and a clipboard, working through the sequence the way Anders worked through calibration, methodically without shortcuts, because the consequences of shortcuts were not abstract. Jacob pulled into the yard at 5:25 in his truck, got out, and stood for a moment looking at the helicopter and the 12 nets lined up on the pad in the gray pre-dawn light. He had a coffee in each hand. He crossed the pad and gave one to Anders without speaking. James finished his pre-flight and came over. He declined the coffee with a small shake of his head and looked at the nets one more time. "I'll take them in drop sequence," he said. "Tower 1 through 12. I'll message you when each one is down and again when I'm back here for the next lift." He paused. "If weather builds over the ridge before I finish, I'll hold at the last completed drop and wait it out. I won't push into deteriorating conditions with a load under the hook." "Understood," Anders said. "I should have all 12 down by early afternoon if the weather holds." James looked at the sky to the west, reading something in it that Anders could not read. Whatever he found there satisfied him. He pulled on his helmet and walked back to the helicopter. The rotors began turning slowly, then faster, the sound building from a low thud to a sustained mechanical roar that Anders felt in his chest. James lifted the helicopter off the pad with a precision that looked effortless, held it in a steady hover 6 feet up, and one of the base ground crew clipped the first net to the hook beneath the fuselage. James held the hover without drift while the crew stepped back and gave the thumbs up. The helicopter climbed, the net swinging in a slow controlled arc beneath it, and turned northwest toward the mountains. Anders and Jacob watched it go until it was a small shape above the tree line and then gone. They went inside. Kowalski was in the ready room with 2 of his crew, going over something on a wall map. He looked up when Anders and Jacob came in, nodded, and went back to the map. The 2 Smokejumpers glanced at Jacob with the brief, evaluating attention that seemed to be a characteristic of everyone at this base. Jacob nodded back and found a chair near the window. Anders spread his own map on the table at the far end of the room, a topographic print of the Payette National Forest with 12 tower locations marked in red. He had studied this map in Billings until he knew the contour lines around each tower, the way he knew the layout of his own factory floor. He looked at it now with the specific attention of someone checking whether reality matched expectation, tracing the flight lines James would be running, calculating the terrain between towers. A younger Smokejumper came over and looked at the map without being invited. He was in his late 20s, dark-haired, with the physical ease of someone who spent serious time outdoors. He looked at the 12 red markers for a moment. "Those are the Firewatch towers," he said. "Yes," Anders said. "I've been up to War Eagle twice on resupply runs." He studied the map. "That's a serious location. You can see halfway to Oregon from up there on a clear day." "The sightline coverage from War Eagle overlaps with Kerry Dome to the north," Anders said. "2 cameras triangulating the same smoke plume gives us an ignition location within approximately 200 meters. The Smokejumper looked at him with genuine interest rather than skepticism. "How fast from first smoke to confirm location?" 12 to 15 minutes from initial detection to drone confirmation, Anders said, depending on wind and distance. The Smokejumper was quiet for a moment. "Last season, we had a fire start in the South Fork drainage. By the time the Kerry Dome lookout spotted it and called it in, and we got jump coordinates, it was 40 minutes. It was already 2 acres. He looked at the map. 12 minutes would have been different. Anders said nothing. He did not need to. Jacob had been listening from his chair by the window. He looked at Anders across the room. Anders was already looking back at the map. The morning passed slowly the way waiting mornings do. Anders reviewed the installation sequence for Tower 1 3 times, not because he needed to, but because reviewing it was more useful than not reviewing it. Jacob walked the base, looking at the equipment, the parachute loft, the rows of personal gear hanging ready in the locker room. He stood for a long time looking at the jumpsuits and the reserve parachutes and the Pulaski tools racked along the wall, trying to understand the kind of person who put all of that on and stepped out of an aircraft over a burning mountain. He did not come to a conclusion. Kowalski found Jacob in the loft building at mid-morning, looking at a parachute being repacked by one of the riggers. He stood beside Jacob for a moment without speaking. "Your father built the system," he said finally. It was not a question. "Yes," Jacob said. "You understand it?" "I built most of it," Jacob said. "With Anders." Kowalski looked at him with the same measured attention he had given Anders the previous evening. He nodded once and walked away. Jacob watched him go and thought about what the nod meant. He decided it probably meant something, but he wasn't certain what. James's first message arrived at 7:52. Tower 1 delivered. Anders noted the time in his field book. Messages came through at irregular intervals after that, as James worked his way through the drop sequence. Tower 2 at 8:21, Tower 3 at 9:04, a gap of nearly an hour before Tower 4 at 9:58 that Anders attributed to the terrain between those 2 locations. He tracked each one on the map with a small pencil mark. The weather held. The messages kept coming. Jacob brought sandwiches from somewhere on the base at noon and set one beside Anders' map without interrupting the sequence review Anders was running in his head. Anders ate it without looking at it. Jacob sat across the table and watched the map and the pencil marks accumulating. Tower 10 arrived at 2:17, Tower 11 at 2:51, then a longer gap. Anders looked at the sky through the ready room window. The cloud was building over the western ridge the way James had described, not threatening yet but moving. He looked at his watch. He looked at the map. Tower 12 was the most remote location, the furthest northwest, in a drainage that James would approach from the south to stay clear of the ridge. At 3:44, his phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up and read the message. He set the phone down and made the final pencil mark on the map. Jacob was watching him. Anders turned the map around so Jacob could see all 12 marks, each one a small, neat cross over a red tower symbol. "All 12, Anders said. Jacob looked at the map for a long moment. 12 crosses, 12 complete installation kits sitting on 12 remote tower landings in the Payette National Forest, waiting in the forest silence for two people to come and bring them to life. "Tomorrow we start," Jacob said. "Tomorrow we start," Anders said. He folded the map precisely along its original creases and put it in his jacket pocket beside his field book. Outside, James was bringing the helicopter back to the pad. The rotors audible now over the base, the sound growing steadily in the mountain evening air. They left McCall at 5 in the morning in their separate trucks, Anders leading, Jacob following, the headlights cutting through a darkness that was complete and absolute away from the town lights. The road south from the base was paved for the first 8 miles, and then it wasn't. Anders felt the change under his wheels and reduced his speed without touching the brakes, reading the surface through the steering. In his mirror, he saw Jacob's headlights adjust the same way a moment later. The forest came up around them as the road climbed. Ponderosa pine first, then Douglas fir, the trees pressing close on both sides of the track, the canopy blocking what little pre-dawn light was beginning to show above the eastern ridge. Anders had driven this road once before 2 weeks ago on a reconnaissance trip from Billings, alone, to assess access conditions and tower locations before committing to the installation sequence. He had not told Jake about the reconnaissance trip. It was simply what needed to be done. The track to Tower 1 turned off the forest road at a wooden marker post and climbed steeply for a further 1.5 miles through switchbacks that required Anders to drop to first gear and concentrate. He could see Jacob's headlights working through the switchbacks below him in the mirror, steady and unhurried. The trucks emerged from the trees onto a small clearing, just as the first gray light was separating the ridgeline from the sky. Tower 1 stood at the edge of the clearing. It was an older structure, steel lattice painted the particular faded red that all Forest Service infrastructure seemed to eventually become. Rising 60 feet from its concrete footings to the small enclosed cab at the top. A set of external stairs switchbacked up the outside of the structure. The landing pad was a flat gravel area to the south side, and sitting in the center of it, exactly where James had set it down, was the net containing Tower 1's complete installation kit. Anders got out of his truck and stood looking at the tower for a moment in the cold morning air. Jacob pulled up beside him and got out. He looked up at the cab at the top of the tower. A light was on inside it. "Someone's up there," Jacob said. "Yes," Anders said. "Her name is Carol Wyrick. She's been the seasonal lookout on this tower for 11 years. Jacob looked at him. "You knew she'd be here?" "I looked up the staffing records before we left Billings," Anders said. He picked up his tool bag from the truck bed and walked toward the tower. Carol Wyrick came down the stairs as they were unloading the net. She was in her mid-50s, weathered in the specific way of people who spend long periods at altitude, wearing a Forest Service shirt and carrying a coffee mug that steamed in the cold air. She looked at Anders and Jacob and at the equipment on the ground with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was not warm either. It was the expression of someone reserving judgment. "Anders Lindqvist," Anders said. "This is Jacob McAllister. We're installing the Firewatch detection system." "I know what you're installing," Carol said. She looked at the Yeti case and the solar panels and the Starlink unit laid out on the gravel. "Kowalski told me you were coming." She looked at the tower railing above them, where the camera housing would be mounted. "How long will you be on the tower?" "Most of the day," Anders said. "The solar installation first, then the Starlink, then the camera system and the main unit. We'll be clear before dark." Carol nodded and looked at Jacob. "How old are you?" 18, Jacob said. She looked at him for another moment, then back at Anders. "I'll be in the cab. I'd appreciate it if you let me know before you start work on the railing." She turned and went back up the stairs without waiting for a response. Jacob watched her go. "She's not happy about this," he said quietly. "No," Anders said. "She isn't." He opened the Yeti case and checked the contents against the installation checklist. "Hand me the solar mounting brackets." Jacob took that as the end of the conversation and went to work. The solar installation took 3 hours. Jacob led it the way Anders had known he would, methodically, checking each step against the laminated checklist before moving to the next, not hurrying because hurrying was how connections got made incorrectly in the cold when fingers were stiff. Anders watched him complete the first panel mount and make the DC connections with clean, precise movements, and then turned his attention to preparing the Starlink mounting hardware. Carol came down once while Jacob was working, walked past without speaking, checked something at the base of the tower, and went back up. Jacob tracked her with his eyes but kept working. Anders noted that Jacob had the instinct not to try to engage her. That was the right instinct. She would come to her own conclusions about them in her own time, and nothing either of them said would accelerate that process. By mid-morning, both panels were mounted and angled correctly for the Idaho summer sun. Jacob connected the charge controller, verified the voltage at the battery terminals, and called up to Anders, who was on the platform above. "Power's live," he said. 14.2 volts and climbing. Anders looked at the charge controller reading on his phone via the Bluetooth monitor he had fitted in Billings. Clean input, correct voltage, battery bank beginning to accept charge. He made a note in his fieldbook. The solar system was delivering. Everything that followed depended on this moment being correct, and it was correct. The Starlink installation took 40 minutes. Anders mounted the unit on the hardware he had cut and drilled in Billings, ran the power cable down through the weatherproof conduit Jacob had fitted during the solar installation, and connected it to the distribution board inside the Yeti case. The dish oriented itself automatically, tilting and turning through its acquisition sequence. Anders watched the app on his phone. Signal bars appeared one by one. Jacob was beside him on the platform. "It's finding satellites," he said. "Give it 2 minutes," Anders said. They waited. The dish stopped moving. The app showed a steady connection, latency within acceptable parameters, download speed sufficient for the data rates the system required. Anders noted the time and the readings in his fieldbook. "Connected," Jacob said. He said it quietly, almost to himself, the way you say something when the reality of it lands slightly differently than you expected. Anders looked out from the tower platform across the forest. The Payette stretched in every direction, ridge after ridge of timber fading into a blue haze toward the horizon. From up here, the scale of it was something you could not fully prepare for. He understood immediately and completely why someone would come up here every summer for 11 years to watch it. He went back to the Yeti case and began the camera housing installation. Carol appeared at the top of the stairs at the platform edge. She looked at Anders working on the railing mount, at the camera housing in his hands, at the 4 lenses of the array pointing in their 4 directions. She stood there long enough that Anders paused and looked at her. "Before you mount that," she said, "I want to show you something." Anders set the housing down on the platform. Carol moved to the railing on the north side and pointed across the forest to a distant ridge. "There's a drainage behind that ridge that doesn't show well on maps," she said. "The slope aspect means it dries out faster than the surrounding terrain in a dry year. It's the most likely ignition point in this sector." She moved to the east railing, and that saddle there. When a fire starts in the valley below it, the smoke funnels up through the saddle before it spreads. You see the smoke 10 minutes earlier if you know to watch the saddle. Anders stood beside her and looked at both locations carefully. He took his phone out and opened the camera coverage map he had built in Billings. He studied it for a moment, then looked at the drainage and the saddle again. He put the phone away and picked up the camera housing. He rotated it 15 degrees from the position he had planned and mounted it. Carol watched him do this without speaking. She looked at the adjusted angle of the array, at the coverage arc it would now have across the drainage and the saddle. She picked up her coffee mug from where she had set it on the platform rail. "I'll be in the cab," she said. She went back up the internal stairs without looking back. Jacob had watched the whole exchange from the far side of the platform. He looked at Anders. Anders was already connecting the camera housing cables to the conduit run. Jacob handed him the weatherproof sealant without being asked. By 4 in the afternoon, Tower 1 was live. The Raspberry Pi was running, the camera feeds were initializing, the thermal array was completing its calibration sequence. The detection algorithm was processing its first real data from a real location in the real forest it had been designed for. Anders ran the system check on his laptop, went through every parameter, and closed the Yeti case. He secured the latches, checked the weatherproofing on every cable entry point, and stood up. He looked at the case sitting in its housing on the tower platform. Then he looked out across the forest. The afternoon light was long and golden across the ridges, and the timber was very still. Somewhere out there, 11 more towers were waiting. Jacob was already on the stairs with his tool bag. "Tower 2 tomorrow," he said. "Tower 2 tomorrow," Anders said. He took one more look at the Yeti case, picked up his own bag, and followed Jacob down. They had a rule from the first day that neither of them had needed to state explicitly. They went into the forest together, and they came out together. Anders had been in enough remote environments to know that the rule was not caution, it was competence. The Payette backcountry was black bear and mountain lion territory and occasionally wolf country, and the towers they were working on were in places where the nearest other person was measured in miles rather than minutes. Both of them carried a sidearm on their belt when they were on site. Anders had a Glock 19 that he cleaned every evening with the same methodical attention he gave his tools. Jacob carried a .357 revolver that Jake had given him before they left Billings, along with a conversation about when it was and was not appropriate to use it. Jacob had listened to that conversation carefully and had not needed to be told twice. By the end of the second week, Anders had established a working rhythm that made the best use of both of them. He would drive with Jacob to each tower site in convoy, both trucks, and they would work the solar installation together on arrival. Anders on the mounting hardware, Jacob on the wiring and connections. When the solar system was delivering clean power, Anders would move to the Starlink and camera work, while Jacob completed the battery bank installation and cable management. They moved around each other on the tower platform with the efficiency of two people who had built the same system 12 times in a factory and knew every step without consulting the checklist. Jacob completed the solar installations on towers 4, 5, and 6 without needing Anders to verify his work at any stage. Anders knew this because he checked the charge controller readings remotely each afternoon, and the numbers were always correct. On Tower 7, Jacob identified a mounting position that gave better panel angle than the installation plan specified and called Anders before deviating. Anders looked at the coordinates, checked the aspect on the topographic map, and told him to use the better position. He noted the deviation in his field book and updated the master plan that evening. He did not tell Jacob that the call had been exactly the right call to make. He assumed Jacob knew. The forest was never entirely quiet while they worked. There were birds and wind and the occasional crack of something moving through the timber below the tower clearing that both of them learned to assess quickly and correctly. On Tower 5, a black bear came out of the tree line at mid-morning and stood at the edge of the clearing, looking at them with the calm curiosity of an animal that had not decided whether they were interesting or irrelevant. Anders and Jacob stopped working. Anders put his hand on his Glock without drawing it. The bear looked at the trucks, looked at the tower, and went back into the trees. They went back to work without discussing it. The Payette River ran through the valley below McCall with the particular clarity of mountain water that has come off snowpack and moved fast over clean rock. Anders had packed his fly rod in his truck beside his tool bags without mentioning it to anyone. On the fourth evening, Jacob found him on the riverbank below the town, standing in the current to his knees, working a dry fly across a seam of slower water behind a midstream boulder. Jacob watched from the bank for a moment, then went back to his truck and returned with his own rod. Anders heard him wade in 20 meters downstream and said nothing. They fished in silence for an hour before either of them spoke. "Dad said you've been doing this since Sweden," Jacob said. "Since I was 7, Anders said. Different fish, same principle." Jacob made a cast that was technically correct but slightly hurried on the presentation. Anders watched the fly drag across the current and said, "Let it drift. The fish is not going anywhere." Jacob mended the line and tried again. The fly settled and drifted cleanly along the seam. A cutthroat trout rose from nowhere and took it with a quiet confidence that made Jacob laugh out loud in surprise. Anders watched him play the fish and release it and stand there grinning in the current with water running past his waders. He looked younger than 18 in that moment and also somehow older. Anders looked back at his own fly and made no comment. Later, sitting on the bank with their rods laid beside them and the last light going out of the sky, Jacob said, "Does he talk to you about me?" "My dad." "Sometimes," Anders said. "What does he say?" Anders considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "He says you think before you act," he said. "He considers that important." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "He worries, though." "Yes," Anders said. "He does." He picked up a flat stone and turned it in his fingers. "That is not the same as not trusting you." Jacob nodded slowly at the river. Anders stood up, collected his rod, and began breaking it down. The conversation was complete. Jacob seemed to understand that and did the same. Anders called Jake from his truck that evening in the McCall parking lot with Jacob already inside the motel. Jake answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone managing three things simultaneously. Anders waited until he heard the quality change. Jake setting the other things down, giving the call his full attention. "Tower 8 is done," Anders said. "All systems nominal. Jacob completed the solar installations on 6 and 7 without assistance. His sequencing is correct and his documentation is clean." He paused. "On Tower 7, he identified a better panel orientation than the installation plan specified and called me before deviating. That was the right decision." There was a silence on the Texas end that Anders recognized. It was the silence of a man receiving information that mattered to him and taking a moment to let it land properly. "How's he doing otherwise?" Jake said. It was not quite a question. "He's doing well," Anders said. "He caught a cutthroat this evening on the Payette. Larger than he expected." Another silence, shorter. "Good," Jake said. Then, "Anders, thank you." "Tower 9 tomorrow," Anders said. "I'll call when it's live." He ended the call and sat in the truck for a moment in the dark parking lot before going inside. The dry lightning came on a Thursday night in the third week. Anders was at the motel desk reviewing the Tower 11 installation plan when his laptop showed an alert from the Tower 3 system. A thermal anomaly flag in the south drainage, cross-referenced with a lightning strike that the weather data layer had logged 40 minutes earlier at the same grid coordinates. The camera feed showed nothing visible in the darkness, but the thermal array was reading an elevated signature that was growing slowly at the edges. Anders looked at the alert for a long time. The confidence score was 68%, above the notification threshold, but below the deployment recommendation threshold that Jake had set at 85%. He opened the weather data, looked at the wind direction and the fuel moisture readings for that drainage, and picked up his phone. He called Kowalski. The base commander answered on the third ring with the alert attention of someone who slept lightly during fire season. Anders described the alert, the confidence score, the thermal signature, the lightning strike location. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. "I'll have someone look at the Carry Dome feed," he said. "If the lookout up there sees anything, I'll call you back." The call came 14 minutes later. The Carry Dome lookout had spotted a faint glow in the south drainage consistent with a small surface fire. Kowalski had already dispatched a reconnaissance flight. The fire was confirmed at 2 acres, moving slowly in light wind, containable with an early ground attack. By morning it was out. Anders noted the timeline in his field book. 40 minutes from lightning strike to thermal flag. 14 minutes from Anders' call to visual confirmation from Carry Dome. The system had worked within its design parameters on its first real event, at night in a drainage that Carol Warwick had pointed to from her tower railing on the first day. He noted that also. The following morning, Kowalski was in the ready room when Anders came in for coffee. He did not look up from the map he was studying. After a moment, he said, "Your system flagged the Granite Creek fire last night before my lookout saw it." "Yes," Anders said. Kowalski said nothing further. He went back to his map. Anders poured his coffee and went to his table and opened the Tower 11 installation plan. Jacob came through the door at 7 with 2 coffees, saw Anders already had one, and kept both for himself without breaking stride. Outside, the morning was clear and cold, and the mountains above McCall were sharp against a sky that promised good weather. 4 towers left. Anders heard the helicopter 20 minutes before it arrived. He said nothing to Jacob, who was on the platform above him connecting the camera housing cables, with the careful attention he brought to every connection in cold weather. Anders continued working on the Starlink mount and let the sound grow from a distant thud to something that filled the clearing and brought Jacob to the platform railing to look. "That's Dad's helicopter," Jacob said. "Yes," Anders said. Jacob looked at him. "You knew." "He called last night," Anders said. "Hand me the torque wrench before you go down." Jacob handed it over and was on the stairs before Anders had finished the sentence. Anders listened to his boots on the metal steps going down, fast but not reckless, and went back to the Starlink mount. He torqued the final bolt to spec and made a note in his field book. Below him, he heard the helicopter settle onto the landing with the particular sound of skids on gravel and the rotors beginning their slowdown cycle. Jake McAllister crossed the clearing with the easy long stride of a man comfortable in remote terrain, his jacket open despite the cold, looking at the tower and the trucks and the equipment laid out on the gravel with the quick comprehensive attention of someone reading a situation in a single pass. Jacob met him at the edge of the landing pad. They shook hands first the way men do when they haven't seen each other for weeks and there is work around them. And then Jake pulled his son briefly into a one-armed embrace and let him go. "Show me what you got," Jake said. Jacob walked him through the installation. Not a tour, a technical briefing. He showed Jake the solar panel mounting, explained the angle adjustment he had made on Tower 7 and why, showed him the charge controller readings on his phone, walked him to the base of the tower, and pointed up at the camera housing on the railing above. Jake listened without interrupting, asked 2 questions, both of them specific and technical. Jacob answered both without hesitation. Anders came down from the platform as Jacob was finishing. Jake looked up at him and nodded. "Anders." "The system will be live by 3, Anders said. "The camera calibration is the last step." Jake looked at the Yeti case sitting open on the equipment table, at the Raspberry Pi blinking through its sequence, at the wiring dressed along the rails in the precise way Anders always dressed wiring. He looked at it for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he conceived in his head and has not yet seen fully realized in the field. Then he closed the case and latched it himself, running his thumb across the weatherproof seal the way Anders did, checking it without thinking about checking it. "It's good work," he said. He said it to both of them, but he was looking at Jacob. They ate lunch in the clearing with the forest around them and the helicopter sitting on the pad. Jake had brought food from McCall, sandwiches and coffee in a flask, practical and unannounced. He sat on the tailgate of Anders' truck and asked Jacob about the towers, about the drive-in each morning, about the bear on Tower 5. Jacob told him about the bear with the ease of someone recounting something that had already become a story worth telling. Jake listened and smiled at the part where Anders had put his hand on the Glock without drawing it. "That's the correct response," Jake said. "That's what Anders said," Jacob said. Jake looked at Anders. Anders was eating his sandwich and looking at the tree line. Jake looked back at his son. "How are you finding it?" Jake said. "The work, being out here." Jacob thought about it for a moment in the honest way he had, not reaching for an answer, but actually considering the question. "It's different when it's real," he said. "In the factory, everything was controlled. Out here, the variables are different every day. The terrain, the weather, the tower structures. You have to think about the installation differently each time, even though the system is identical." Jake nodded slowly. "That's the job," he said. "That's what the factory can't teach you." Anders finished his coffee and stood up. "The camera calibration won't do itself," he said. He picked up his tool bag and went back to the tower. He heard Jake laugh quietly behind him, a short, genuine sound, and he heard Jacob laugh also, and he climbed the stairs and left them the clearing and the afternoon. Jake stayed for 2 hours. He walked the full installation with Anders while Jacob completed the final cable management, asking questions that went to the design logic rather than the execution. Why Anders had positioned the Yeti case on the north face of the platform rather than the south. Why the battery bank was isolated from the main housing rather than integrated. Whether the Starlink positioning created any interference with the thermal array at certain satellite angles. Anders answered each question directly and without elaboration. On two of them, he told Jake that the field conditions had produced a consideration and the factory testing had not revealed. Jake listened to both carefully and said he would look at it. At 2:45, the system came live. All feeds green, detection algorithm running, confidence scores within normal parameters, Starlink uplink steady. Anders ran the full check sequence on his laptop and called the results to Jake, who was standing at the platform railing looking out across the forest. Jake did not respond immediately. He stood there looking at the timber and the ridgelines and the drainages running away below them in every direction. At the country his system was now watching. 11 live, Anders said. 1 remaining. Jake turned from the railing. He looked at Jacob, who was coiling the last of the cable offcuts with the automatic tidiness of someone who had done it enough times that it required no thought. He looked at Anders closing the laptop. He looked at the Yeti case latched and sealed on the platform, its camera housing pointing in 4 directions across a forest that had been watched by human eyes for 100 years and was now being watched by something that did not sleep. I need to be back in Texas tomorrow morning, Jake said. I know, Anders said. Jake went down the stairs first. Jacob followed with the tool bags. Anders took one last look at the installation, the cable runs, the housing seal, the panel angles, the Starlink dish oriented correctly, and went down after them. In the clearing, Jake shook Anders' hand properly, both hands the way he did when something mattered. He turned to Jacob and looked at him for a moment. Call me from Tower 12, he said. I will, Jacob said. Jake walked to the helicopter and ran his pre-flight with the same methodical attention Anders recognized from his own pre-work checks. The rotors began turning. Anders and Jacob stood back from the downdraft and watched the helicopter lift from the gravel clearing and climb above the tree line, turning south toward McCall and then east toward Texas. The sound faded. The forest came back around them, the bird calls and the wind in the timber and the creek somewhere below the ridge. Jacob stood looking at the sky where the helicopter had been for a moment. Then he picked up his tool bag. We should get the clearing tidied before we lose the light, he said. Yes, Anders said. They went back to work. The storm came in from the northwest at 11:43. Anders was at the motel desk with his laptop open on the network overview screen, not because he had been expecting trouble, but because he slept lightly during weather events and the barometric pressure had been dropping since early evening in a way that he had noted without comment at dinner. Jacob was asleep in the adjoining room. Anders had not woken him when the first alerts began coming in. The first flag appeared at 11:51. Tower 7 southeast drainage, thermal anomaly cross-referenced with a lightning strike logged 4 minutes earlier. Confidence score 72%. Anders noted it and watched. The second flag came at midnight. Tower 3, the same south drainage that the Granite Creek fire had started in 6 weeks earlier. Confidence score 81%. Anders opened the camera feed and looked at the thermal image. The signature was larger than Granite Creek had been at the same elapsed time. He noted the wind direction from the weather data layer, southwest, pushing toward heavier fuel. The third flag came at 12:17. Tower 11, a drainage in the Frank Church backcountry that Anders had never seen from the ground and could only know from the topographic map he had studied in Billings. Confidence score 91%. The thermal signature was already moving at the edges. Anders looked at the 3 flags on the network overview screen for a moment, then picked up his phone and called Kowalski. The base commander answered on the second ring. Anders could tell from the quality of his voice that he had not been asleep. I see 3, Kowalski said, before Anders could speak. You have the feed, Anders said. I've had it since Tower 7 flagged. I've been watching. A pause, the sound of Kowalski moving, a door opening. Give me your assessment of the Frank Church ignition. 91% confidence, Anders said. Thermal signature consistent with a surface fire between half an acre and 1 acre. Wind is southwest at 12 knots, pushing into standing dead timber from the beetle kill on the north slope of that drainage. The drone confirmation puts the ignition point at grid reference. He read the coordinates from the screen. No road access within 11 miles. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. Anders could hear voices in the background. The base coming awake, lights going on, the ready room filling. The Tower 3 fire, Kowalski said. 81%. Larger thermal signature than the Frank Church ignition, but accessible by ground crew from the Warm Lake Road if they move in the next 2 hours before the wind shifts. And Tower 7, 72%, still below your deployment threshold. I'd want another drone pass before committing to that one. Anders paused. The drone is already returning from the Frank Church confirmation. It can be back over Tower 7 in 19 minutes. Kowalski said nothing for a moment. Anders waited. He understood that what was happening on the other end of the call was not hesitation. It was a base commander with finite crews and 3 simultaneous fires, making a resource allocation decision with better information than he had ever had before, at this hour on a night like this. The quality of the information did not make the decision easier. It made it more clearly his. I'm sending 2 jumpers to the Frank Church ignition, Kowalski said. 4-man crew to Tower 3 via Warm Lake Road. Tower 7 gets the drone confirmation before I commit anything else. Another pause. Anders, your confidence scores. How reliable are they at night with smoke particulate in the air? It was the right question. Anders had been waiting for it since the first flag appeared. The thermal array is not affected by smoke particulate at night, he said. The visible spectrum cameras are degraded. The confidence score algorithm weights thermal more heavily in low visibility conditions. Jake built that in specifically for night fire detection. He paused. The 91% on the Frank Church ignition is a thermal primary score. I would treat it as reliable. Understood, Kowalski said. He ended the call. Anders set the phone down and looked at the network overview screen. 3 flags, 3 drainages, 3 fires burning in the dark in the Payette and the Frank Church, while the storm continued moving southeast and the lightning strike layer on his weather data was still showing fresh hits across the coverage area. He opened a 4th alert that had appeared while he was on the call. Tower 9. Confidence score 44%. He watched it for 2 minutes. It did not climb. He noted it and left it. He knocked on Jacob's door. Jacob opened it in 30 seconds, fully alert in the way of someone whose father had raised him to come awake quickly. He looked at Anders. Anders turned the laptop screen toward him without speaking. Jacob looked at the 3 flags and the drone confirmation data and the deployment decisions Kowalski had already set in motion. He sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the screen for a long time. 3 at once, Jacob said. The storm cell covers most of the network, Anders said. There may be more before morning. Jacob looked at the Frank Church ignition coordinates on the screen. He looked at the topographic overlay showing the drainage, the fuel load data, the wind vectors. The jumpers going into the Frank Church, he said. What's the landing zone like? Anders pulled up the jump coordinates assessment the system had generated automatically from the terrain data. He turned the screen back to Jacob. Jacob read it and said nothing. He was thinking about 2 people stepping out of an aircraft in the dark over a burning drainage in roadless wilderness, and Anders could see that he was thinking about it and let him think. The drone confirmation on Tower 7 came in at 12:58. Confidence score had climbed to 78% during the wait. The drone thermal showed a small ignition, less than half an acre, in a drainage with good natural fire break features on 3 sides. Anders called Kowalski with the update. Kowalski listened and said he would hold on Tower 7 and reassess at first light. Anders agreed that was the correct decision. He sat at the desk and watched the screen and drank cold coffee and monitored the network through the rest of the night. Jacob pulled a chair beside him and stayed. Neither of them slept. The storm moved through, and the lightning strike layer gradually emptied of fresh hits, and the 3 confirmed fires burned in their drainages, while the people Kowalski had sent went toward them in the dark. At 4:17 in the morning, Kowalski called. The Tower 3 fire was contained at 3 acres. The Frank Church ignition was at 2 acres, and holding, the 2 jumpers had made the landing and had a scratch line around the downhill edge and were working the flanks. Tower 7 was showing a reduced thermal signature, possibly a smoldering log, possibly a very small surface fire that the overnight humidity had suppressed. They would know at first light. Your system flagged all 3 before my lookouts called any of them, Kowalski said. Yes, Anders said. The Frank Church fire. A pause. By the time my lookout on Tower 11 would have seen that in daylight it would have been running. The fuel loading in that drainage, he stopped. Your jumpers are on the ground because of a 91% confidence score from a thermal camera on a tower in the dark. Yes, Anders said. Kowalski was quiet for a long moment. I'm going to need Jake McAllister's direct number, he said. Anders wrote it in his field book, tore the page out, and knew he would give it to Kowalski in the morning. He set the phone down and looked at the network overview screen. 3 flags still showing, all 3 with drone confirmations, all 3 with crews either on the ground or staged and ready. 12 green indicators holding steady across the Payette National Forest. Jacob was asleep in his chair beside the desk, his head tilted back, his phone still in his hand. Anders looked at him for a moment, then looked back at the screen. Outside the motel window, the first gray light was beginning to separate the ridgeline from the sky above McCall. It was going to be a clear day. He opened his field book and began writing up the night's event log. There was a lot to record and he wanted to get it right. The 2 jumpers came back at 7:40 in the morning. Anders and Jacob were in the ready room with coffee when they heard the aircraft and went to the door. The plane came in low over the lake and touched down on the McCall runway with the unhurried competence of a pilot who had made this approach many times. Anders and Jacob stood outside the ready room and watched it taxi to the base apron. They came off the plane carrying their gear and their tools, both of them dark with smoke and ash in the particular way of people who have been close to fire through a long night. Their Pulaskis were slung over their shoulders. They moved with the careful, deliberate pace of exhausted people who were not going to show the exhaustion until they were inside. The rest of the base crew came out to meet them without fanfare. No ceremony, just people going to where their colleagues were and taking gear from their hands and walking beside them. Nobody said much. The saying much would come later when they had slept. Jacob watched them cross the apron. Anders watched Jacob watch them. The expression on Jacob's face was not hero worship, and it was not pity. It was the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of what other people are capable of. Anders thought it was probably the most valuable thing Jacob would take home from this summer, and it had nothing to do with solar panels or Raspberry Pi boards or thermal imaging cameras. Kowalski met his jumpers at the ready room door, spoke briefly to each of them, and watched them go inside. He stood for a moment on the apron looking at nothing in particular. Then he turned and looked at Anders. He walked over and stood beside him and looked at the runway where the plane had been. 2 acres held, he said. They had the scratch line down by 3 in the morning. Another hour and that fire finds the beetle kill on the north slope, and we're talking about something very different by dawn. Anders said nothing. The numbers were in his field book, and he did not need to repeat them. Walk with me, Kowalski said. They walked the perimeter of the base in the cool morning air. Anders and Kowalski, Jacob a few steps behind. Kowalski asked his questions the way a man asks questions when he has already decided something and is now working out the practical consequences of that decision. He asked about the maintenance schedule for the camera systems, what failed in field conditions, and how often and how it was serviced. Anders told him the camera housings were designed for minimal maintenance and that the most likely failure point was the weatherproof seal on the Yeti case latches in sustained cold, which could be inspected and replaced by any competent technician following a procedure Anders had written and could provide. Kowalski asked about the winter operation of the drone return-to-base system. Anders told him the drone housing heating element maintained battery temperature to operating range down to -20 Celsius, and that below that threshold the system defaulted to a hold-and-wait protocol rather than attempting a return flight in conditions that would compromise battery performance. Kowalski nodded and asked what the hold-and-wait protocol meant for detection capability during a winter fire event. Anders told him the fixed camera array continued operating independently of the drone, and that the drone was a confirmation layer rather than a primary detection layer. The cameras did not stop watching because the drone was grounded. Kowalski asked about the alert integration into base procedures. How did the confidence score translate into a decision framework his crew chiefs could use without Anders being present to interpret it? This was the question Anders had been expecting since the network went live, and he had a document ready. A 1-page protocol he had written in the motel at 2 in the morning 3 weeks ago and refined twice since. He took it from his jacket pocket and gave it to Kowalski. Kowalski read it while they walked without slowing his pace. He folded it when he reached the end and put it in his shirt pocket. "You wrote this before last night," he said. "Yes," Anders said. Kowalski looked at him briefly. Confident. Prepared, Anders said. They completed the perimeter circuit and came back to the ready room. Kowalski stopped at the door and looked at Jacob. Your father built a good system, he said. He said it plainly, without qualification, the way a man states a conclusion he has arrived at through evidence rather than persuasion. Jacob received it the same way. A nod, no performance, no visible satisfaction beyond the quiet kind. Kowalski went inside. Anders and Jacob stood on the apron in the morning sun. The lake was visible beyond the airfield, flat and bright, and the mountains above McCall were clear against a sky that had no weather in it. I need to call Dad, Jacob said. Yes, Anders said, but I'll call him first. Jacob looked at him. Anders took out his phone and walked a few steps away toward the flight line. Jake answered before the second ring had finished, which told Anders he had been awake and waiting since before the storm had cleared. 3 confirmed ignitions, Anders said, all 3 flagged by the network before visual confirmation from any lookout. Frank Church fire is contained at 2 acres. 2 jumpers on the ground through the night, scratch line down by 3 a.m. Tower 3 fire contained at 3 acres by ground crew via Warm Lake Road. Tower 7 assessed at first light. Smoldering log, no active fire, no deployment required. He paused. Kowalski wants your direct number. The silence on Jake's end was brief and complete. How did the confidence scores perform, he said. The Frank Church ignition scored 91% at night with smoke particulate in the air. Anders said. Kowalski deployed on it. It was the correct decision. He paused again. The thermal primary weighting you built in for low visibility conditions performed as designed. I told Kowalski it was reliable. It was. Another silence, longer. Anders waited. Anders, Jake said. Yes. Well done. He said it simply, the way Jake said things that mattered, without decoration, without qualification, in a tone that made it clear the words carried their full weight and no more was needed. Jacob should tell you the rest, Anders said. He turned and held the phone out. Jacob took it and walked away along the flight line, with it pressed to his ear, and Anders watched him go. The easy stride, the straight back, the way he gestured with his free hand when he talked the way Jake did, and then looked away toward the mountains. He took his field book from his jacket pocket and wrote Kowalski's number on a clean page, tore it out carefully and went inside to give it to him. They spent the last day at the base doing the things that needed doing before they left. Anders updated the maintenance documentation for all 12 systems, printed 2 copies, and gave one to Kowalski and one to the base's technical coordinator, with a conversation about what to look for and when to call him. He went through the alert protocol document one more time with the crew chief, who would be the primary operator during the winter season, answered every question completely, and wrote his direct number at the bottom of the document in his own handwriting. Jacob spent the morning doing a remote diagnostic check on all 12 towers from his laptop, verifying that every system was reading correctly, noting 2 minor calibration drifts on towers 4 and 8 that were within acceptable parameters but worth monitoring. He documented both and added them to the maintenance log. By early afternoon, there was nothing left to do. The tools were packed in the trucks. The empty equipment cases were stacked in the truck beds, where the full ones had ridden from Billings 7 weeks earlier. The trucks looked lighter, and they were. Kowalski found Anders in the ready room doing a final check of the network overview screen. He stood beside him and looked at the 12 green indicators without speaking for a moment. Then he extended his hand. Anders shook it. No words were exchanged because none were required. 7 weeks of careful work and 1 long night had said everything that needed saying between them. The young smoke jumper, his name was Darnell, Anders had learned it in the 3rd week, came out of the loft building as Jacob was doing his final truck check. He crossed the yard and said something to Jacob that Anders could not hear from where he was standing. Jacob listened and nodded. They shook hands the way young men shake hands when they have witnessed something together that has changed how they see the world. Darnell went back inside. Jacob stood by his truck for a moment, looking at the base buildings, at the ready room and the loft and the jump towers, at the aircraft on the apron. Then he got in his truck. Carol Wyrick had come down from Tower 1 3 days earlier for her monthly resupply visit. She had not come to the base, but Anders had found an envelope pushed under his motel room door on the 2nd morning after the storm. Inside was a single page torn from a field logbook. On it, she had written the GPS coordinates of 4 additional ignition-prone locations in her sector that were not on any map he had seen, with notes on the seasonal conditions that made each one dangerous. At the bottom, she had written, in the same precise handwriting as the coordinates, "The inversion adjustment you made was correct." E.W. Anders had put it in his field book between 2 clean pages and carried it back to the base. He would update the camera sensitivity profiles for Tower 1 sector before the end of the week. They drove out of McCall in the early evening, Anders leading, Jacob following, the trucks moving through the town and past the lake and onto the road east. The mountains were behind them. The Payette National Forest was behind them. Somewhere in those mountains, 12 Yeti cases sat on 12 tower platforms, watching 12 sectors of forest in the long summer light. Thermal arrays reading the air, detection algorithms processing data, confidence scores accumulating quietly with no one present to observe them. The network did not know that the people who had built it were leaving. It simply continued doing what it had been designed to do. Anders drove and thought about nothing in particular, which was rare enough that he noticed it. In his mirror, Jacob's truck held its distance on the road behind him, steady and unhurried, the way Jacob did everything now. They stopped at a pullout above the Payette River Valley as the light was going gold across the water. Anders got out and leaned against the hood of his truck. Jacob pulled up beside him and got out and stood looking at the valley. The river was a silver line through the timber far below. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Good summer," Jacob said finally. "Yes," Anders said. "It was." Jacob looked at the river for another moment. Then he got back in his truck. Anders stayed at the hood a moment longer, looking at the valley and the mountains and the sky above them, and then he got in and drove. There are people in this country who go toward the fire, not because they have no fear of it. Anyone who has stood close to a wildfire in mountain timber, felt the heat on their face and heard the sound it makes moving through standing fuel, understands that fear is the only rational response. They go toward it because someone has to, and they have decided, each of them individually and deliberately, that they are the ones who will. The Smokejumpers of McCall and Missoula and Winthrop and the 7 other bases across the American West are fewer than 500 people. 500 people covering millions of acres of roadless wilderness where fire moves faster than any ground crew can follow. And the only way to get ahead of it is to fall from the sky directly into its path. They carry hand tools. They dig lines down to mineral soil with a Pulaski and their own strength, and they hold those lines through the night, and they walk out when it's done, sometimes 20 miles through burnt country with everything they brought in still on their backs. There are fire lookouts who climb to towers on ridgelines every summer and live there alone for months, watching. They have been watching the same country for years, some of them for decades, learning it the way you learn something you have given your full attention to for a long time. Not just what it looks like, but what it means when it looks a certain way. They call in fires that get caught early because they were watching and they knew what they were seeing. The ones that get caught early are the ones nobody hears about. That is the nature of prevention. Its successes are invisible. Technology will not replace these people. A thermal camera cannot tell you what the fuel moisture means in a specific drainage on a specific slope aspect after a specific sequence of weather. A confidence score cannot carry a Pulaski up a ridge in the dark. An algorithm cannot decide that this is the line and hold it. What technology can do is give these people more time, earlier warning, better information, a fighting chance at the window that closes fastest, the first hour when a fire is still small enough that 2 people with hand tools can change what it becomes. That is what the cameras on the towers are for, not to replace the jumpers, not to make the lookouts redundant, to give them the one thing that fire season never provides enough of, time. Never ever let us forget those brave men and women who protect these forests, because in doing so, they protect us. These people are the real heroes. They do not ask to be celebrated. They ask for the tools to do the job and the time to do it before the job becomes impossible. They have been doing this work quietly and completely, season after season, in country that most people will never see, for as long as there have been forests worth protecting. They will be doing it long after the cameras are gone. Remember them.